Weeks had passed, and Shigo was horribly depressed. Draken was a little happy when he found out that he had emergency changing back fluids, so he was back in his normal adult body. Abby decided to leave, seeing that this is what a family matter, but Shigo told her to stay because she grew to like Abby, and she didn't want to lose anyone else at the time. Shigo couldn't get out of bed, nor she could eat. If she was to eat, Draken fed her. Coming up to their room, Draken had made Shigo soup since she was sick at the time. Opening the door, he looked at the messy bed and shook his head. Shigo was tangled in the white sheets and was still in her pajamas that she hadn't left in a few days. Coming over to the side, Draken sat down sadly and looked at his wife's wet face. "Are you feeling any better, Pumpkin?" he asked quietly, as he slowly pushed out her damp bangs from her moist forehead. Tears quickly and lightly fell for her eyes, as she had her eyes locked on the opening shining window next to the chair in their bedroom. Draken then let out a deep sigh and looked down sadly. "I'm sorry he's gone, Shigo," he said, almost a whisper. Shigo then opened her mouth, and when Draken saw that she did, he jumped into happiness because it was the first time in weeks Shigo had moved any muscle in her body. He was so young and curious. Shigo spoke in a voice that was totally dead, and when her lips spoke hurt because they were dry and cracked, plus she was very sick. "I wish I never became a villain and had that fight with them in that day," she cried, remembering the day she left Team Go and met Draken at the beach. Draken now felt horrible. Maybe Shigo and Draken should have never met. If so, none of this might never have happened, and Shigo would be good, hopefully, and be with her brothers, and keeping them safe along with Higo in the Go Tower, and save the world from evil. "I'm sorry if I made all this possible," Draken spoke quietly. Then unexpectedly, Shigo burst of energy shot up straight out of her bed. "What?" she snapped. Her eyebrows narrowed as she looked like a hungry wolf. "I said," he responded happily, to see Shigo back to her normal self again. "I'm sorry if I made all this possible. Maybe it wasn't the fate that brought us together. Maybe it was just hatred and evil," he said, staring at his feet. Then Shigo did something very unexpected to Draken. Something she had never done before towards him. She smacked him hard across the face, leaving a little red. "What was that for?" he then asked, quickly annoyed. He looked at his angry wife. "Don't you ever speak like that again. Fate and love brought us together. And how could you say that you're sorry for what happened? It's not your fault." Shigo then said as her voice started to soften, and so did her eyes, and she flew into Draken's open arms and cried on his shoulder as he patted her back. "Shh, everything is going to be okay," he said, and with that Shigo and Draken spent some time together and let out some of their thoughts. More weeks had passed, and finally Shigo was back to her own old self. Every now and then she would get a little quiet, but she would still laugh every now and then. Still wondering what scroll was about, Shigo decided to do some research behind their lair. She would type in the lairs and be in many places, and would come up after a while. She found nothing. Shigo even called the realitator and that sold their lair to them, but he said that he only knew that it had horrible, brutal history behind it. Going back to the internet, Shigo typed in horrible histories. Many disgusting and frightening things came up when Shigo looked up and saw and just ignored them. After 6 hours of searching, Shigo was tired and felt as if she needed to lie down. Walking by the calendar in the kitchen, something caught her eye. The clock had seemed to stop and she fixed it. Checking off the day calendar, Shigo had realized Mother's Day had passed, and she remembered Draken and had taken Abby out, and they were to spend the whole day together. They included Shigo, but she wasn't doing well. Plus, she told Draken it was a day for him to spend with his mother anyway. Why does he have to scratch this off? Shigo thought curiously, as she saw that on Father's Day there was a hole in it. Why won't he just tell me what happened? Shigo then screamed as her hands started to glow, and she smiled evilly, feeling the power. Why won't he just tell you what? Draken said, coming up from behind her, wrapping his arms around Shigo's body, and pulled her hair back and kissed her neck romantically. Shigo moaned a little and slightly laughed as she got goosebumps. Man, I love it when he does this to me. She fought as she pulled her closer to his body. What are you looking at? He asked softly, as he kissed her some more, and kissed the top of her head and stared at the calendar. I was just fixing the clock and I saw that you decided to X off. No, I should say X off. I should say stab out Father's Day on the calendar, Shigo asked, turning around and looking at him deep in the eyes. Draken let out a deep sigh and walked over to the chair and sat down in it. I don't like to remember it. If I do, it hurts, Draken said, looking away and moving his hand to his stomach, wincing when he touched it. What hurts? My... Drew, you could please help me move something? Abby said, just at the last minute as Draken was going to tell Shigo what hurt him. Yes, mother, here I come, he said quickly, then jumping off from the chair and hurried off to his mother, leaving poor Shigo standing there alone, confused and sad. Good timing, Abby asked quietly, winking at Draken as they entered the next room. Yes, an excellent timing. I almost told her, he whispered back. Abby then let out a deep, depressing sigh. Well, she is your wife, and you have to tell her sooner or later. I mean, tomorrow is Father's Day, Abby said. Draken gulped, and he looked hard into his mother's foretelling eyes, and then nodded as his head and helped her unpack some boxes from upstairs. That night Shigo ate dinner, and was very talkative, but Draken and Abby barely even looked at her, and made poor Shigo feel even more depressed. Doing the dishes, Draken kept drinking more and more wine. Dear, you have had enough? Why don't you go and shower and I'll finish this? Shigo said, not looking at him this time. Draken nodded his head, but instead of going up to the room, he poured himself another glass of deep red wine and cheered it to her, and then went to stand in front of the fire. Draken's heart started to hurt as he closed his eyes and bit his lower lip as he felt the warmth grow up in his body as he stood next to the fire. Shigo's back started to hurt as she told him that she was going to go up for a shower, but he didn't answer her. Fine, have it your way, Shigo said, muttering under her breath as she jogged up the stairs and hopped into the shower. As Draken stood there, thinking harder about his past, he started to hear voices in his head. Don't take her away. Dad, I'm sorry I hurt you in the past. Come back, Dad. Come back. More and more voices ran in his head as he started to twitch. Little did he know that he opened his eyes and looked into the fire and angrily threw his drink, along with the crystal glass, into it, making it rise up more. Draken stepped back in caution and knew that he was a little drunk, but he shook his head and ignored it. Stumbling over towards the sofa, Draken's heart burned inside of him, and he decided to lie down on the floor and looked up at the ceiling. His back ached, but he didn't feel like going up to bed just yet. Tomorrow is Father's Day. What am I going to do? I'm in such a nervous wreck. Draken then fought angrily as he turned onto his side and looked at the flaming fire in front of him. After Shigo's long hot shower, she stepped out and ruffled her hair with a dark green towel. Wiping away the mirror, she looked deep into it and closed her eyes, thinking hard about Draken and her baby. She then shot open her eyes and saw something behind her more. Spinning around quickly with her fighting position, she noticed that she had the shower curtain closed. Cautiously, she walked over and held her breath, as her heart was pounding harder in her chest. With a much thought of her might, she wiped away the curtain and shook her head in disgust to see a little brown mouse at the bottom of the tub. Shigo laughed and picked it up, gently holding it in her pale hands. Good boy. Now what were you doing in my shower? She asked, taking it out of the room and opened the window. Looking around, Shigo noticed that the mouse had left her hands and already jumped on a tree branch and was heading down to solid ground. Slightly laughing, Shigo walked back in and jumped into her robe and walked downstairs. The thing that amazed her the most was that she was no more than a few feet away from the fire, and she felt his strong warmth. Spotting Draken on the floor, she walked over and stood above him. Hi, Shigo, he said quietly, as she sat down on top of him. Hey, Aren't you tired? Shigo asked, yawning and blinking her eyes. No, not really. But if you are tired, you may go to bed. You don't have any objection to stay up if you don't want to. Yeah, she said, yawning. I know. Hey, Drew, he then whispered. Yeah? What's wrong? You just don't seem happy. I mean, it is because Father's Day is coming tomorrow, and I mean like something like you should be happy. I mean, you are going to be a father soon, Shigo said, smiling brightly at him. Yes, I know, but it's not that, he said, turning his head and looking deep into the flames. What is it? Shigo then whispered as she lay down on him and rested her wet head upon his chest and closed her eyes. It's the history about my dad and Kylie, he responded. Kylie? Shigo then growled through her teeth. I think you still like her in some way, Shigo snorted. Draken laughed. It was many years ago. She's probably dead now, he said sadly, as his big puppy dog eyes became filled with crystals of small tears. Then letting out a deep breath, Dr. Draken was ready. Shigo, sweetheart. Yes? I think it's time I tell you what happened in my childhood and why I am the way I am. Shigo's eyes then bulged open and she smiled to herself as she started to talk. And she closed her eyes and ran in his fingers through her hair. And with that, Draken started to tell Shigo the horrible history he once lived. It all did start when my dad would start coming home at night with horrible cuts and bruises all over his body. Plus half the time, my father Greg was drunk and made things worse. He never beat ya, did he? Shigo asked, lifting her head and looking into his eyes. No, Draken then whispered, as she lowered her head back down to his chest. My dad would always tell me that my mother and him had a bad day at work, but my mom was much wiser than he saw straight out of him. Greg wasn't even ever a bad father towards me. He would also treat me with respect and would protect me from Alan Dentor and his gang. Draken growled angrily, remembering Alan and how he treated Drew as a child. Alan? Who's he? Alan Dentor. He was my worst enemy when I was a child. He would pick on me and physically hurt me at school, and when no one was around, bringing his large whip to school, and when he had the chance and no one was looking, he would grab me and whip my back until I was raw and crying. Draken, that's horrible, Shigo then said, shocked. I know, but then she came, Draken then said in a dreamy voice. Shigo rolled her eyes and breathed. Let me guess, Kylie, she responded dully. Yes, her name was Kylie Paris. She was my savior. She was the most popular, prettiest, and nicest girl in school, and when Alan was strong, she would be there to protect me and stand by my side, Draken said, wiping away every small tear. Now knowing that she was long gone dead, whatever, Shigo mumbled so quietly she barely heard herself speak, and buried her head more into Draken's chest. But I do know that I'm going back to my past. I would have dreams, or should I say illusions. Illusions? Yes, illusions. Quite weird, actually, because they came true, Draken said, gulping hard. I would have the same dream almost every night. It was a horrible night, and it was about my dad getting killed. I do remember how it went. It was a dark and rainy night, and Greg had just come home very drunk and wasn't looking too good. Drew was upstairs in his room, and it had been a week since he and Kylie had over, and she ran off home in tears for some mysterious reason. Drew would never know why she had gone home, and why she was screaming out his father's name, but he was soon to find out. Drew was playing with his marbles until a dim light next to his unmade bed was lonely. The clock struck 9 o'clock, and Drew shivered and went over to his dresser and pulled out his pajamas. When he heard his dad's car pull up in the driveway, smiling with joy, since he hadn't seen his father all day, he forgot about getting ready for bed and quietly walked downstairs and hid away and waited for his dad to come home. Abby was sitting in her chair rocking back and forth, twiddling her fingers in an annoyed way, and she saw that Greg was home. Stumbling out of the car door, drunken Greg had made his way up the brick stairs and barged on the door. Abby let out a deep breath and walked over and opened it, not looking at him. He fell on his face, nor did Abby help him get him up. She just walked over to him and watched him burn the fireplace. Drew wanted to greet his dad since he missed him today, but from what he saw, he didn't think it'd be a good idea, and that made Drew even more depressed. "You're late," Abby said in a dangerous tone, as Craig walked over on his knees and slugged down on the sofa. "I said you're late," Abby said, in a more angry tone this time. "What?" Craig said, annoyed, so looking into the space of his mouth hung open in a stupid way. "I said you're late. Today was the day you were going to be with Drew to go at him with his big surprise," she said, her eyes dashed from the fire to his droopy, drunken face. "Oh yeah, why don't you get that kid's surprise thingy?" Greg sputtered. Abby then walked over and kicked him in the leg, making him yelp in pain. "Shut up," she growled. "How dare you speak to me that way, Greg? After all I've done for you, and this is how you repay me and over your son who came home today with more cuts on his face because of the bullies at school? Why don't you just come home like you said you were around 4 and spend some quality time with him, huh?" "Oh, let me guess," Abby said sarcastically, clapping her hands together. "You were at so-called work, which you refused to tell me about, and I think I have a pretty darn idea what it is." Abby snapped as she quickly walked past him, and then walked outside and got more firewood. Drew's little red heart was pounding quickly in his chest, because he knew when his mother was angry, it wasn't a pretty sight. When his parents fought, he scolded himself for coming down here. Abby then walked back and dumped the dirty wood into the fire and burned it more quickly and fiercely. Coming back over to Greg with her arms folded, she looked at him straight in the eye. "So?" he hiccuped. "What do you think I do for a living, dear?" Greg said, getting up on his wobbly feet and wouldn't stand still. "You're cheating on me, are you, Greg?" she whispered. "Cheating on you?" He howled with laughter. "No way, honey. You know you're the only girl who can do me and turn me on the way you want to. You do that special thing," he said, coming closer to her and putting his hands around her waist, but she brushed him away and he held his grip. Drew didn't like to hear he just heard. He shivered in disgust and looked at the sentence out of his head. "Come on, Abigail. Let's go upstairs, Greg moaned, pulling her closer to his body, making sure they were both pressing against each other. "No," Abby then said fiercely, and pushing him onto the chair. "What was that for?" he stuttered stupidly. "Get off of your fat ass and go upstairs and tell your son why you weren't home today like you promised him." "You promised him, Greg. He looks up to you. Why can't you just look at him and give him a good influence? What the hell is wrong with you? You're tearing this family apart." Abby then started to scream and grabbed her hair. Drew was starting to cry softly to himself. Man, he hated his life. He hated his dad when he would come home like this every night. He hated that his mom went into her mental breakdowns in front of Greg, and all he would do is to smack her across the face. He hated to be picked on, but the only joy of his life was Kylie, and for some reason, she felt gone as well. "Abby, don't cry, baby," Greg said, coming closer. "Get away from me!" she screamed in horror, knowing that Greg was drunk and was very dangerous. "Oh, come on, Abby, just come upstairs with me, please," he whined. "No, I hate you. You're cured to make you not drunk, Greg," she snapped. "But it's the only cure I have. I mean, please. Drew won't mind. The little freak is already asleep anyway." Greg sputtered, rolling his eyes. That was when Greg had broken Abby's chain. He had just broken their seal. Greg had just called his only son, who has no soul and no friends, a freak. Abby's kind eyes were not flames of raging fire. Drew was holding his breath and more crystal tears streamed down his angered face as he heard his father call him a freak. "How dare you call your own son that, you sick sob?" Abby roared at the top of her lungs. "You call me that one more time, Abigail, and I swear to God I'll rip every limb off of your freaking body," Greg roared in one hand. Abby's frightened eyes locked upon the fist and was ready to take a blow. "No!" Drew then screamed, as Greg punched her hard across the face, leaving her motionless. Drew then ran out of the cupboard and that he was hiding, and ran over to his mother's motionless side. "Mommy!" he then screamed, he holding his head gently, noticing there was blood coming out of her nose and mouth. "Drew?" Abby whispered, as her eyes fluttered and she noticed her crying son above him. "Get back!" Greg then roared. picking up Drew and throwing him across the room. And then he picked up again and thrown across the stairs. Drew didn't move. There was total silence in the house. Abby was mortified and let out a scream of horror, and as Greg stood there blinking his eyes and was terrified of what he had just done. He had almost broken his son's frail body into nothing but dust. Drew's little head was drooped over, and his hands were on his knees were motionless. Every part of his body hurt, and his world was spinning. Greg then shook his head fiercely and was drunk no longer. "Drew!" he cried, running over to his son's body and picking it up. As Drew's lifeless body head rolled back, his body went limp. "No!" Greg cried as he dropped to his knees and started to cry. Abby managed to get up and rushed her son's hopeless slide. Laying him down, Abby then picked him up and hurried him to his bed. She checked his pulse and her heart started to beat again, which in such relief as it thumped on his thin throat. After a few moments of total silence, the only thing that could be heard was Greg's thumps as he thumped his head on against the door. "Stop, please," Abby whispered, as more tears streamed down her face. Greg looked up and touched his sore head, and he obeyed his wife. He had already done so much damage more tonight. Within a few moments, Drew then started to flutter his little eyelids and sat up. "Drew," Abby said, holding his wet cloth against her face and stopped the bleeding. "Mom, are you okay?" Yes, I'm fine. What matters is that you're all right?" Abby asked, checking his arms and legs, seeing if there was anything broken. "My back hurts," he yawned, because it was past his bedtime. Greg groaned and wished that he had a gun so he could blow his brains out, because he hurt his family so very much tonight. "I'm sorry," Greg whispered, looking down at his feet. "I'm sorry I hurt you, son. I'm sorry if I ever beat you, Abigail. I promise I will never hurt any of you again," Greg then said as he started to breathe heavily and rushed out of the room. Abby then looked at Drew, and Drew looked at his mother, and they both shrugged and cleaned each other up. Abby apologized to Drew and was so very sorry if she upsetted him in any way. "No, you didn't upset me, Mom. I just feel so rotten why you and Dad always fight." "Well," Abby said, letting out a depressing sigh, "I guess your father and I just don't have very much in common." "Well, I mean, we do. We're both your parents," Abby chuckled, and Drew smiled. "But I guess sometimes he just doesn't realize that he has to be a good father and not get drunk every night." "Yeah, I guess you're right. Hey, Mom, why isn't Dad's car in the driveway anymore?" Drew then asked nervously, jumping off bed and hurrying to view. "Oh, he said that he'd be home this afternoon, and that he said he's meeting tonight at the pub. I think it was called the Sorcerer's Pub." Sorcerer's Pub was the only thing ringing in Drew's mind. He quickly spun around and started to breathe heavily in horror. "The Sorcerer's Pub?" Drew stuttered, dreading that this was the night from his horrible nightmares of Greg getting killed at the pub. "Yeah, that's it." "Drew, what's wrong?" Abby asked, nervously slowing getting off bed. "Mom, we have to go after Dad," he then screamed, running past her and flying down the stairs. "Drew!" Abby yelled, confused and frightened. "What's going on?" she then demanded as she came down the stairs and got her coat as he did the same. "I'll explain on the way, but right now we have to go to that pub. Dad is going to die," Drew yelled in a hurried voice as he ran out of the door and jumped into Abby's Jeep. Okay, I'm coming," she then said, quickly rummaging through the keys and unlocked the doors, and they both sped off into the night. "Drew!" she then asked out of breath. "What?" He then snapped quickly at her. "How do you know your father's gonna die? I don't even know why I'm believing you." "He's fine. Come on, let's go home," Abby then said tiredly as she started to turn the car around. "No!" Drew said as he grabbed the wheel and pushed her aside. Then he squirmed his little body down near the pedals and pushed fiercely on the gas pedal and kept his beady eyes on the road. Abby was breathing heavily as she watched her son struggle to keep the car straight. "I've been having nightmares," he finally said, hurried some more. "What?" Abby asked, confused, looking at Drew. "I said I'm having nightmares, and they're about Dad at this pub, and he gets shot. I've had them for so long time now," he whispered, as he quickly dashed at his horrified mother. "I don't know what in the world you're talking about, Drew, but I believe you. Here, let me drive, you're struggling too much," Abby said, taking the wheel. Greg, on the other hand, was at the sorcerer's bar and was getting drunk. He had bumped into the man with red-brown hair and brown eyes, the same one Drew's nightmare. Abby had finally reached the pub and jumped out of the car and wasn't surprised to see Greg's car, but she had an odd feeling about what her son had said. Drew then jumped out from behind and felt a wet shiver run down his spine as he walked up under the sign and looked up. Closing his eyes and breathing heavily, Drew knew that his nightmare had just begun. Abby came up to her son and the two looked puzzled. "Come on, this way," he signaled her with his tiny hands as he headed towards the door. Right as he was about to walk up, the stone stairs door flew open. Drew gasped as it was Greg. "Dad!" he cried, hoping that he hadn't been shot yet. "What's up, Drew?" he moaned as he started to stumble forward. Abby quickly rushed over, but then stopped in fright because she saw a man that had red and brown hair behind Greg had a gun and was yelling at him. Abby then screamed as the man with red and brown hair pressed the trigger and shot Greg in the back. Drew was as white as the moon, and Abby watched her husband fall, then rushed to his side. The man inside was laughing evilly and got his back and hurried towards the dead body. "Dad!" Drew then screamed as well, as hurried over to his father's side. Greg moaned for a few seconds and then shook his head. "What happened?" Greg asked, as he slowly looked around, realizing he was in Abby's arms. "Oh, thank God you're all right," she then cried, holding him closer. "Yeah, Dad, you're okay," Drew said, hugging his father, who smiled and overjoyed being loved. "Get away from him," yelled the man in a very dangerous tone. "What do you want with Greg anyway?" Abby said, frightened what that man would just shoot her. "This is business now. Get away from him," the man roared, and with that he smacked his hand across hard on Abby's face. "No!" Greg yelled, as he jumped and tackled the man as hurt as a poor abused wife. Drew was in much shock, seeing his father was going to beat this man to the ground. He decided that he would help his mother. Abby's face was dark red from the smack and she was crying. "Mommy, shh, it's okay," Drew said, holding his hand and wiping the brown hairs off her face. "You stay the hell away from her," Greg then growled as the man pushed from his grip and looked at Greg straight in the eye. The evil man let out a horrible laugh and started to talk. "You brought this on yourself, Greg. It's all your fault." "It's not so much my fault. How dare you say that? I didn't bring up the group of men who had the same desire and make them hate each other, huh? No, I didn't. And I didn't send out a bunch of guys to kill an innocent man. That man, when he died, was in the little girl's arms. And 2 weeks later, her mother died from a man named Ive." But then Greg was about to finish when the small man jumped on top of him and started to beat him. Abby was weak to move, so she just sat there and cried, praying that she could move her body to save her husband. Greg then pulled the man's hair, and he screamed and he punched poor Greg in the stomach. They kicked each other more and more, and then cut each other. "Henchmen!" the little man yelled. It was out of the dark alleyway came 8 muscular men. They were all wearing silver suit and coral-colored helmets. One by one, the men were whipping out their swords, and Greg was being pinned to the ground and was scared to death. He didn't want to lose his family. He loved Abby and Drew more than anything, even the world domination. "Tell your family, Greg. Tell them what you do for a living," the man hissed. Greg just narrowed his eyes and didn't answer. "Tell them!" the man screamed as he punched Greg across the face. More blood flowed from his mouth. "Tell us so he will stop hurting you," Abby whispered, looking deep into her husband's eyes. Greg then let out a deep breath and began to tell. "First of all, I'm sorry, Abby, for ever lying to you and hurting you. I'm sorry I ever got caught up in this mess, and I'm sorry I was never a good husband. I love you," Greg whispered, as little crystal clear tears started to stream down his dirty face. "Drew, my son, I love you so much. Don't ever forget that I have always loved you, ever since the day you were born. I'm sorry I was never there to scare the monsters away when you were frightened, and I'm sorry I was never their hero. Tell them what's really going on," the man then crackled, interrupting him. "I work with the mob, Abby," he sighed. "What?" Abby breathed, confused. "Ever since Richard and I were brothers, we had one goal in life, and that was to take over the world." Abby was white as the moon, and she had thought he was just crazy, but he sure wasn't. Yes, I know it may sound horribly absurd, but it's the truth. Then later on in our life, Rich and I would bump into Bronco. Greg then said, glaring up at the man with the hair, and his name was Bronco. Bronco Dentor. He changed my life. We worked as a team until he found other men, Sean Paris and Matthew Go. We were all very important to this mission, and we all had a purpose. Mine was to make many gold chains, he said, glaring down at Drew, who slightly nodded, remembering when he found his dad and all those stacks of gold hidden behind the barn. Sean's waste was to get the liquids so he could possibly find. And why is that? Because after we took over the world, we were all going to put everyone on liquid subtil like mind control device and Matthew. Craig then sighed sadly, crying a little more. Poor Matthew. He had the hardest job of all. He held the diamond of Akita. Once we had everyone under our power, and we had the diamond, we could go in time, and back in time everything would be perfect. But like always, there was a bump on the road. Things weren't going so well, and we all started to get on each other's nerves. Sometimes we would come to work and not want to each other alive. It wasn't until Bronco then told me that Matthew wanted this for himself, and he went out some man to kill him. And Sean, why in the world did you ever hurt him? Craig said, crying some more. I killed him. Bronco's voice was cut off by someone else who spoke. Drew's mouth was then open, and stepped out a girl with golden blonde hair and slimmering eyes. Her face was fierce, and her race and body was covered in army clothes. She also had a big laser gun in her hands. Kylie? Drew whispered. He couldn't believe it. You killed my father because he couldn't make the mind control formula quick enough. You're a sick sob. It isn't, my little Kylie Paris. Do you have a nice time in seeing your father being put to shredder? He asked evilly, cutting off Greg, and slowly walked over to Kylie, who was ready to shoot. She was only 11, and she had a gun that was twice her size. Get back, you evil, sick man. Your stupid plan would have never worked, she cried. And how could you do that? I'm psychic, Kylie then said, as she fired the gun, and a rainbow color beam shot out and hit Bronco directly in the chest. He then screamed and was thrown back down deep in the mysterious alley. The henchmen roared and then ran towards her with knives in the air. Kylie! Drew screamed, then running towards her. Greg had managed to get up and touched his back and pulled out the bullet from his back bullet protector he wore across his chest. Greg? Abby moaned, as Greg rushed to her side and held her in arms. Drew! He then screamed, as he saw his son trying to protect Kylie. Kylie, look out! He then screamed, as Drew pushed her out of the way, and the henchmen missed their cut. Kylie looked around and then noticed that Drew was upon looking at her eyes dreamily. Hi, she moaned, smiling. Thanks for saving me. Any time, Drew said, smiling. Then out of the corner of the Kylie's eye, Bronco had gotten up and was very angry. Look out! She screamed. He started to run towards Greg, but he got up and fight him. What do we do? Greg asked, ducking from Bronco's punch. I don't know, Kylie then screamed, as she grabbed her gun and shot some more henchmen who were not paralyzed. Finally, there were only 2 henchmen left, and Greg was exhausted. Poor Abby was too weak to move, and Kylie was the hero for the whole ordeal. I never liked you, Greg. Why won't you just die? Bronco then roared as he whipped out a pocket knife and jabbed it across Greg's face. Greg yelled in pain and stumbled backwards and lay against the cold, hard wall. Greg! Abby cried, reaching her hand out to him. Bronco then walked over and he held Greg up against the wall and jabbed the knife right into his stomach. No! Drew screamed as everything started to be in slow motion. There were horrible ringings in Abby's ears as tears fell down from her face. She was reaching out her hand and was crying for Greg. He was pinned against the wall by Bronco, who was laughing evilly, and he fiercely pulled out the silver bloody knife. Poor Greg laid on the ground breathing heavily. Dad! Drew then screamed in shock as he rushed over to his father's side and held his head. Drew, my son. It's okay, Dad, I'm here, Drew then whispered, starting to cry. Abby had managed to crawl over and sat holding her both her son and her dying husband in her arms. Kylie was speechless as she had just shot the last henchman and seen Greg fall to his death, and was horribly sorry for what happened. I love you both, and I will always be with. Do you remember me? And those were the final words Greg ever said, and with that his head went limp, and he was dead. Drew cried fiercely, but it was silent, and Abby did the same. Then, out like spears from the sky, it started to rain. Bronco stood there in front of them, looking at his dead henchman, and looking his head in disgust. Then he looked back at the crying family, and didn't seem to care anymore. His angry eyes locked on Kylie, who shivered, and slowly stepped back. Ah, my dear, sweet Kylie. Why don't I take you home, Bronco said, with a sick, twisted smile, as he started to come towards her like an attacker. Get back, she then warned, pulled up her gun, and fired, but nothing came out of it, and Kylie was white. Oh God, she then whispered. Bronco threw his head back and howled with laughter. Well, it seems our little Miss James Bonds has run out of fuel and doesn't have any more juice, he growled. Drew had whipped away some of his tears and turned around to see what was going on, looking in fear. Here, Kylie was just looking at the girl she loved, and he had just lost his father. He couldn't lose Kylie next. Leave her alone, Drew barked, getting up and walking towards Bronco, who then quickly whipped out his knife in surprise and slashed it across Drew's stomach. Drew! Kylie screamed, dropping the gun and rushing to his side. Poor Drew was screaming at the top of his lungs because his stomach had been sliced, and he was on his knees, covering his wound, and blood spit out of it. Drew, oh my God! Abby screamed in horror as she crawled over to his side. Drew was breathing heavily, and his eyes were filled with tears. He could see his whole world ending as he saw flashbacks when he was a baby and the years of school which he had so far. Then slowly turned his head to look in Kylie's sad eyes. Kylie, he managed to say, but his words were taken away by Bronco yelled the name. Out of darkness and came a creature he thought he would never see. Come to father, Bronco roared as he turned around, and out of the darkness landed a dragon. Kylie's eyes were wide as she saw this beautiful creature. The dragon had a pointed face and two large twisted horns, and it was blowing white puffs of air from its long nostrils. Its slits and its eyes were crystal gray. The dragon's scales were creamy white, and it had red veins running through the thin parts of its wings. Oh my God, Abby whispered, as her face dropped as she saw the dragon. She was about to faint, but she couldn't now. What was that? Drew then asked, in a groggy state as he was about to pass out when he saw the dragon. My good girl. Good you came to my rescue. Bronco then chuckled as the boy stepped off the dragon and walked out of the darkness and into the moonlight. The boy was Kylie and Drew's age and had hazel and brown eyes. Kylie's mouth dropped open as she breathed the name in horror. Alan Dentor. She couldn't believe it. How could she not realize that Bronco Dentor was his father? Hello, Kylie, he said, running his finger through his hair, pretending to be cool. Good, you finally made it, my son. Seems like our little Lipsky boy finally got what he deserved, huh? Bronco said, patting his son's shoulder proudly, looking at Drew and Abby, who were both bleeding and crying heavily. Love so much violence, he then said, looking over around and seeing that Greg was dead and seeing that the dead henchman. Yes, my son, but it's worth it though, Bronco then whispered in Alan's ear. They both then laughed as Kylie cried in disgust and ran over to Alan and started to beat him with his clenched fist. I hate you, she roared. Dad, let's leave, Alan then screamed, pushing Kylie into her father as he gripped her shirt and dragged her over the dragon. Help! Shrieked Kylie as Alan and Bronco got on the dragon and they flew off. Help me! Kylie screamed, and with that her voice echoed in the night. Abby had tried to help Kylie, but she could walk and all she could do was cry, holding her son while he bled on her body. She prayed with all of her might and hoped that he would live. In the distance he heard sirens of police cars and ambulances, and she had a great feeling that everything was going to be okay. That night was so hard for Drew and Abby. Drew would never thought he would never see Kylie again because she had been kidnapped by a man who dreaded her the most. His father was murdered for no reason. He was just trying to protect his family. and he was sorry for all the times he hurt Drew and Abby. Abby knew that night of history in their family, nothing would ever be the same for both of them. Never again. And that was how my father and Kylie disappeared. And that night changed my life, Drew then said, finishing his dark, sad tale and looking into Shigo's eyes and realized that she was crying. Drew, I'm so sorry, she whispered as a tear rolled down her cheek. I never knew. It's all right, Draken whispered sadly, looking at the fire, and he realized that it had died during his storytelling. I know I understand why you dreaded Father's Day so much. It brings me back memories, she said, looking down. It was that every day when I got my scar and my dad died and Kylie was taken away by Alan. That was Father's Day. I'm so sorry, Shigo then wailed as she held him close and cried in his chest as he hugged her back and closed his eyes. I never knew Draken had such a horrible childhood. I do feel bad for all the times I treated him badly, Shigo thought as she buried her head into his chest some more and felt more protective in his strong arms. Then Draken kissed her forehead gently as she smiled and looked up at her love. Shigo would never leave Draken's side, and he would never leave her side, and together they would always fight the challenges they'd come and go. Come on, it's late. Let's go to bed, he said, holding her more closely as they got up and walked up the stairs. Halfway up, Shigo turned around and looked at the clock. It was 12:01 a.m., and it was Father's Day.
What's up, my pretties? It's the Lion Queen here. I want to appreciate you all for tuning into this video, and I do appreciate you guys supporting my video by giving this video likes and stuff. If you really enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, comment and subscribe if you're new, ring the bell for notifications to when I upload so that way you guys will get updated for whenever I upload. If you want to follow me on Twitter or DeviantArt, feel free to leave a follow on those if you are interested in following me on those socials. If you want to support my backup channel, known as Miss Dark Shigo, feel free to subscribe to it, as a link to that will also be in the About page section. And with that being said, and that being the case, thank you so much for watching, my pretties, and as always, please stay pretty.